Let's talk firearm safety. This lesson will apply to all firearms, whether we're talking pistols, rifles, shotguns, muzzleloaders, or any other type of firearm that you could possibly imagine. Now, this is basic information, meaning that the skills and the things I'm going to talk about related to firearm safety are common to all firearms, and it is basic information. However, don't let that deter you from listening to this, even if you're an experienced gunner and you've been carrying handguns or firearms or hunting for your whole entire life. That is really irrelevant, because what I've found is the more you handle firearms, the more prone to dangerous activity you are, and the more prone you are to having an accident. So it is basic information, but it applies to all walks of life who handle firearms, whether as a daily part of your job or as a hobby, or if you're a concealed carry or defensive firearms user. This is going to apply to everything in all aspects of firearms. So let's get into it. For the duration of this lesson on firearm safety, there are two pieces of equipment or two parts on a firearm that I want to point to that we're going to commonly discuss. And that's going to be the muzzle and the trigger. The muzzle is where the bullet actually comes out of when the gun fires, so it's obviously coming out of the muzzle. And then you have the trigger. So the trigger is actually the actuator of the firearm itself. All firearms are going to have a muzzle and a trigger. So those are the two common parts that we're going to reference when we talk firearm safety. Now, there are a lot of firearm safety rules out there that apply to different conditions, meaning you're out there on the street carrying concealed, or you're specifically at a firing range with specific rules, or maybe you're taking a firearms course and there may be specific rules associated with that. And then you have different styles and types of firearms that have different safety features on them that would warrant different handling procedures to handle them safe. However, what I'm going to discuss is common to all firearms, as I mentioned, and it's going to apply specifically to the muzzle and the trigger of any firearms. So generally speaking, the most important rule of firearm safety by far is muzzle management. And what I mean by muzzle management is this being the muzzle, is keeping the muzzle pointed in a safe direction at all times. So it's important for us to define what a safe direction is. A safe direction is that direction that's not pointed at another human being and anything too expensive. Primarily not pointed at another human being. So we want to keep the muzzle pointed in a safe direction at all times, meaning away from all people. And that includes ourselves, which is often overlooked. So with muzzle management, if I take this pistol right here, as I'm handling the pistol, I always want to keep the muzzle, the front of the gun where the bullet comes out of, I want to keep that pointed in a safe direction at all times. Now, it's important to understand that we live in three-dimensional environments with upstairs, downstairs, walls, things like that, and bullets have a tendency to go through a lot of things and cause a lot of damage. So you really need to keep in mind when you're handling firearms and you're thinking muzzle safety or muzzle management, you have to consider that bullets will travel through things like thin walls or floors or ceilings and things like that. And they'll go a long way. So you need to realize that what you see right in front of you may appear to be safe, but it really isn't because of what's beyond your immediate vision. So keep that in mind when you're thinking muzzle management. So more on muzzle management before I even handle a firearm. As I see a firearm, whether it's a pistol, rifle, or shotgun, and I'm thinking about picking it up. Maybe I open up a box, or I go to a gun store, or I'm getting ready for range day, or I'm getting ready to go on a hunt. Before I even pick up my firearm, I'm thinking, how can I pick up my firearm and how can I handle it and keep the muzzle pointed in a safe direction? So you need to think about that before you even handle a firearm or take it out of a holster or pick it up off a table, whatever it is you're doing. So as I pick it up here, I need to be thinking, do I have a safe direction over here? In this case, I do. So I'm handling it, muzzle pointed in a safe direction. And that should always be on your mind. And that is the thing that I've seen in my experience as a firearms professional that is often overlooked. And sometimes what I see is people get caught up in their own little world of their gun and them in their immediate area, and they're not thinking about more in-depth area that's around them where there's people around. So it's very easy to point your muzzle at somebody, and you need to be very conscious not to do it. It's also very easy to point it at yourself, meaning laser your arm or your leg or your chest if you're handling it, clearing it, loading it, unloading it, things like that. So you need to be very aware at all times where the muzzle of the gun is. So professional firearms firearms users, which you are now because you're getting professional firearms education, we never point our muzzles at anything we don't intend to destroy or at anything we don't intend to shoot. Meaning we're not going to point our muzzle at any person, period, unless that is the goal in a defensive type of situation. So generally speaking, muzzle management, keep your muzzle pointed in a safe direction at all times. The next thing we're going to discuss is trigger finger discipline. So we went through muzzle management, that's keeping the muzzle pointed in a safe direction at all times, and the next big one is going to be trigger finger discipline. So all firearms have a trigger. The trigger is what actuates the firearm and what makes it work. So this could be a pistol, a revolver, a shotgun, a rifle. It doesn't matter. They all have triggers and they all have muzzles, as we've already discussed. So anytime I'm thinking about picking up a firearm, handling it, taking it out of the holster, getting ready for a hunt, I need to be thinking not only about muzzle management, but as I pick up and handle my firearm, I immediately need to think about keeping my finger or fingers or anything else for that matter away from the trigger. So the way we do that as we handle firearms is we keep our finger what we call indexed straight forward, and in some cases slightly up. So as you can see, I'm holding the semi-automatic pistol here. I've got a full hand grip with my dominant hand on the gun, and I've got my finger off the trigger as opposed to finger on the trigger. So finger is off the trigger, and typically the finger is pointed slightly up. So that is typically the way we keep our finger off the trigger. Now there are some variations to this. Some will put their finger straight forward, so parallel with the gun. Some slightly up, and some will actually hook the finger slightly. Whatever it is you choose to do is right as long as you're off the trigger. I personally tend to, as I grip the pistol, my finger is straight and slightly up and visibly off the trigger. So if you're looking at me from the right or left side, you can clearly see the opening in front of the trigger where the trigger guard is, and you can see that it's not obstructed and my finger is in no way close to that trigger. So that's what we call trigger finger discipline, meaning keeping the finger off the trigger until we're ready to fire. So let's talk about that. When are we ready to fire? Well, that's when we're pretty much coming up on target, our sights are getting ready to line up, or we're ready to take a shot and we're on target ready to fire. That's when it's typically safe to put the finger on the trigger. Now, for you shooters who are experienced, there's nothing wrong with prepping the trigger, meaning as you're coming up on target and you're right in that target area, putting your trigger finger on the trigger to prep the trigger. That is acceptable, and you obviously have to have that level of training. For most, we want to wait until the muzzle is absolutely on whatever it is you want to shoot, and you're getting ready to line up your sights before the finger ever goes to the trigger. So those are the considerations right there. Additional on keeping your finger off the trigger, as you're handling the firearm, you need to be very conscious of your finger off the trigger. It is very natural to pick up a firearm, especially for new users, and to immediately put the finger on the trigger. It just feels good, and that's the way it was designed. It has a trigger, your finger goes in there, so it's natural to want to go ahead and put your finger right in there. And the untrained person will often look like this. So what's going to set you apart from an untrained person to a professional gun handler, which you're going to be after you watch this video, is keeping your finger off the trigger, indexed forward and slightly up, and that's how you want to do it. So anytime you're handling your firearm, again, rifle, pistol, or shotgun, fingers off the trigger, as you see here, and that's especially important in all circumstances, but if you're, say, using a handgun and you're going back to the holster or coming out of the holster, obviously in those cases, you absolutely want to make sure your finger is off the trigger at all times. So there it is, trigger finger discipline. So let's wrap this discussion up on firearm safety. And again, this is firearm safety that applies to any firearm that you could possibly imagine. Muzzle management and trigger finger discipline. Keep your muzzle pointed in a safe direction at all times, meaning away from all people, to include yourself, and then trigger finger discipline, meaning keep your finger or fingers or anything else for that matter off and away from the trigger at all times until you're ready to fire. If you do those two things, muzzle management and trigger finger discipline, you are guaranteed not to have any problems. What's nice about those two schools of thought, muzzle management and trigger finger discipline, is there's built-in redundancy with those two things. If we take muzzle management and trigger finger discipline, that's two things. The reality is you could actually do one of those things wrong and still be safe. Meaning, if I pointed my muzzle in an unsafe direction, but had my finger off the trigger, the gun is not going to fire. Thus, it's considered safe. However, that is not safe because you have your muzzle pointed at another person. However, with your finger off the trigger, the gun's not going to fire. Not the right thing to do in any way, shape, or form, but you can see that there's redundancy built into these two simple safety rules. If we turn that around, let's say that we had our finger on the trigger, but we had our muzzle pointed in a safe direction. Well, if we pull the trigger and the gun goes off, well, the gun doesn't destroy anybody and doesn't hurt anything, so that is considered safe. However, again, not the right way to do it, but there is redundancy built into these two rules. So if you put the two together, muzzle management and trigger finger discipline, you are guaranteed not to have any safety issues. So that applies to all firearms, and it is something that you consciously have to think about. Firearm safety is not common sense. It just doesn't happen. You need to be formally trained, professionally trained in good firearm safety handling as you are right now until you actually get it. So just because you've been carrying firearms a long time, you've had guns for a long time, maybe you've been a hunter your whole life, if you've never had actual formal training on firearm safety like you are right now with E3 Firearms Association, up until this point, you've probably never really understood firearm safety and how absolutely important it is. And like I said, the more you handle firearms, the more prone you are to accidents. So this is something that should stick with you for life, and it's always in the forefront of your mind anytime you handle firearms or are about to handle firearms. So always think firearm safety, muzzle management, and trigger finger discipline.